So again, good evening. We are looking forward to our virtual conversation tonight on a tree protection article in the UDO. Tim, you go to the next slide. Just really quickly running through meeting procedures. Everyone on this call will be muted. We're going to maintain sort of a mute over all attendees. If you have a question or a comment, we're asking everyone to please drop that into the chat. You can find the chat generally at the bottom of your screen. There's a little, looks like a word bubble. It says chat underneath it. If you click on that, it should pop open in the side of your screen, and you should be able to enter your questions or comments in there. As an icebreaker, we're going to ask everybody who's on the call tonight to drop in their name, and if they're here representing a neighborhood association or a company or any sort of group, please include that in your chat message. We're just asking people to kind of get started with the chat with just that simple information. We're going to spend time presenting on all of the content throughout on the tree article, and then we will go to question and answer at the end of the session. We're going to try as best we can to answer questions in the chat as they're submitted, but those that we can't answer in the chat, we will take care of at the end of the presentation. And I don't see anybody dropping anything into the chat. Hopefully everybody can find a chat. Oh, there we go. If you could drop your name and your group or sort of organization you represent again in the chat, that'd be great. So the purpose of this meeting is going to be to explore first the policy foundation for the tree regulations, then look at the concepts that we've incorporated into the tree article in the UDO, and then go to questions at the end to clarify standards. We're really trying to use this session to clear up any confusion or questions that folks have about the standards. There's going to be a separate process where you can submit comments about sort of your feelings or your opinions on the standards, and we'll talk about that as we go through the presentation. Next slide. So it's kind of a stock slide that we always talk about. Why are we developing a UDO? The Unified Development Ordinance is going to be the primary regulatory tool for implementing the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan. The comprehensive plan sets out the vision about what we want to be as a city, and the UDO then sets standards or sort of more concrete guidance that is required to be followed if you're developing in Charlotte. So that's the main reason we're developing UDO. There's also several other benefits that are listed here. Among them are simplifying terms, making the ordinance a little more user-friendly, using graphics, and aligning development regulations. So the different ordinances are working together. They'll be sort of updated all at the same time, as opposed to the current state of our development ordinances that were all written at sort of separate times over the past 30 years. So next slide. As an overall sort of zoom out of the UDO, this slide is going to show you sort of everything that's in the UDO. You see zoning, which includes a lot. Most of the UDO is based in zoning. And then there are sections on subdivision, streets, and infrastructure, which get at sidewalks and street lengths and street standards. And then the stormwater and natural resources section has obviously our stormwater requirements, but it also includes the tree protection article, which we will be talking about tonight. And then also sort of administration and enforcement are the sort of final chapters in the UDO that you'll find at the end of the UDO. The next slide. So key dates, if you've been to one of these meetings before, you've seen this probably 3 times already, but the long and short of it is we are in the first phase of public engagement with the UDO. Oh no, there we go. We are running public engagement through January 2022, January 14th, 2022. You can see here that we will have a second draft as well as a public hearing draft that will be open for public comment and feedback. Ultimately, we'll be working with City Council to bring this up for a vote for adoption in July of 2022. So there's a lot of time ahead of us. As we all know, time flies, but this is kind of the the roadmap for the coming months on the UDO schedule. Next slide. And then again, we want to bring this up to remind folks that as we're talking about tree regulations, there are several policies that are going to guide the types of regulations that we're going to talk about tonight. The Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan sets the vision for many of the regulations that we're going to be talking about in the tree article. You can see a stamp there, kind of what we tried to make look like a stamp was the Tree Canopy Action Plan. And what the Tree Canopy Action Plan was is a 12-month stakeholder and public engagement process that we went through in 2020 and 2021 to look at our policies, look at some data on tree canopy, and start to analyze and come up with guidance for our policies and our ordinances for how to regulate and how to revisit our tree policy. So you will see that stamped throughout this presentation. There's going to be several policies that we talk about as adopted comprehensive plan policies and that were guided by the Tree Canopy Action Plan. Next slide. And with that, I'll hand it off to Tim Porter, who is the Chief Urban Forester for the City of Charlotte, and he's going to talk about all the regulations. So Tim, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Can everybody hear me? Can I get a thumbs up from someone? Okay, good deal. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your time and your interest. Building on what Andrew just relayed as part of the TCAP project, that was a companion effort with the comprehensive plan. There was some data analysis, and we built upon some work that was completed by Tree Charlotte, looking at a citywide canopy analysis. We drilled down in a couple different areas, and some major points are, well, first, let me start with the map image. The pink indicates existing tree canopy circa 2018. It's tough to see the orange. The orange blobs indicate canopy loss. So at a quick glance, it may look like, okay, it's still robust. And I think it is, but what was determined was that from 12 to 18, over that 6-year period, the city lost about 4% tree canopy, or approximately 10,000 acres. Kind of a net gains loss analysis, we declined 10,000 acres. Most of that canopy loss occurred in residential areas, primarily individual lots, infill development, non-subdivision kind of mass clearing scenarios. Of course, there was canopy loss across all development types, but a bit surprising was this infill individual lot result that was the biggest driver of canopy loss over that time period. We saw losses in all canopy sizes, individual trees, and also large contiguous patches. Just interesting note is that the infill development was primarily made up of individual trees and small patches, and incrementally, it was a little bit surprising to see that that was the biggest source of loss over that window period. We also saw canopy loss in all areas, including our public rights of way where city trees are. The main themes that drove our proposed revisions were alignment and streamlining and simplification of the current tree ordinance as it's brought into the UDO, seeking more flexibility for development customers, looking at revising the 3 big development regulatory areas in the current tree ordinance, targeting new regulations in residential infill. This is an area the city currently does not regulate for tree canopy items. And then lastly was administration. And overarching over all those 5 major themes and concepts is the goal of having the right balance of preservation, planting, but also flexibility for all interests. Connected to the alignment and streamlining theme are proposed changes for the applicability of the tree ordinance, also known as the triggers. If you look on the left here under the current ordinance, some significant changes we're proposing is to shift away from a specific parking space quantity trigger, also a 10% facade change trigger for buildings. We're proposing in the new article on the right, just some clarifying language on what new development is targeted, which would be new construction of a principal structure. And we're pivoting from the parking and facade changes to a built upon area and building coverage trigger, and clarifying that approval of a subdivision subject to the subdivision ordinance would be also a trigger for the full host of tree protection article development requirements. I also want to mention on the bottom here, I referred to it a little bit earlier, was a step into the infill development world. We're proposing regulations in that type of development type. We're not proposing to have that development type comply with tree save. There would be a possible heritage tree provision and a tree planting, perimeter tree, street tree planting requirement for infill. And I'll talk about that in just a moment here. So what are the big three concepts? And these are the big three development requirements. Perimeter trees, also known as street trees. It's number one. Number two is internal trees, which are trees on private property, typically parking lot trees. There's also a requirement for a certain amount of impervious cover on a site. For every 10,000 square feet, you need to plant at least one tree, but it's typically parking lot trees, as that graphic implies. And the last bucket is green area, which is the evolution of what's currently called tree save. We're expanding the menu of options there and rebranding it as green area to better articulate the type of options that will include tree save and other tree canopy elements, but also some non-tree green components as well. And diving in to specific, key important proposed changes. Heritage trees is the one we're starting with here. And that's a requirement that would protect all native North Carolina tree species that are 30 inches in diameter or greater on private property or non-public street right-of-way property within the city limits. They'd be protected at all times. It wouldn't be something that has to be triggered by development permitting. In the planting realm, important changes would be an infill requirement. That second bullet, one tree for every 40 feet of road frontage. For infill residential development, single lot development, that's new. That mirrors and aligns with our existing perimeter tree requirement for commercial and large single family subdivision development. That would allow existing trees to comply. We'll touch base on all these changes in more detail in just a second. And also another key area for preservation is the green area requirements that are carrying forward existing tree save options, but also expanding that menu of options. There's additionally extra credit incentives built in. We're proposing extra credit for development customers if preservation of existing canopy on steep slopes, adjacent to stream areas, or adjacent to existing tree save or protected canopy areas is provided. Again, residential infill development wouldn't be exempt from tree save. That type of development would have to provide the frontage perimeter planting requirement and also preserve any heritage trees if they exist. The tree canopy preservation program is now a donation option if a development customer qualifies. We're also proposing to update the payment in lieu tree save option. This is an option, again, not every customer would qualify, but in the most urban dense areas, if you're not exempt, you have the option to pay in lieu of preserving tree save. And we're proposing no changes to the formula structure, but just updating one of the variables, which is based on it should be based on current county appraised land values. Right now, there's a cap that goes into multiplying to determine the fee a development customer would pay, and that cap is based on very outdated data. And I'll dig into that a little bit more. It's a little bit complicated unless you use it all the time. And lastly, but certainly not least, it's a significant proposed increase in tree save percentage for single family subdivisions, going up 5% from 10 to 15%. So diving in a little deeper on internal trees, and again, reminding everyone that the ordinance concepts that came out of the comprehensive plan and the tree canopy action plan are being carried forward in our proposed UDO regs for the tree protection article. Heritage trees is a significant, proposed regulation. Again, it's every native North Carolina tree species and tree greater than 30 inches in DBH. There certainly would be allowances for the removal of any hazardous, high-risk trees that are imminent threats to life and property. Those could be removed without a permit, without mitigation. But in most cases, if the tree was not hazardous in an emergency situation, we proposed mitigation requirements and a permit in order to remove the tree. So diving in a little bit more, here's an expanded view of the mitigation requirements. The starting point would be a $1,000 fee. And we conducted peer city analysis to look at how other cities apply this. And our approach is coming in below our other peer cities as far as mitigation requirements. Those cities would be Raleigh, Atlanta, Austin, Texas, Washington, DC. There's a fee of $1,000 and a mitigation replanting component. So one tree in addition to that fee is required. And let's skip down to the bottom of the slide here and go through an example, a very basic example. If there's an existing 45-inch heritage tree right here, if authorized to remove, there'd be a mitigation requirement of planting one tree and submitting a fee of $1,000, or you could plant additional trees for every inch of diameter removed. So a 45-inch tree would be rounded up to 50 inches, divide that by 10, and you would plant 5 trees. That would reduce the fee to $500. We acknowledge this is it's a big step. It certainly would influence and impact, the developability of certain sites and what property owners could do on their properties. But it's also really targeting, we're trying to find the right balance of slowing the decline of canopy loss on infill single lot development. It aligns with comprehensive plan policy, and we really are looking forward to getting as much feedback as we can on this specific topic, because we know it's very important and we really want to know what the community from all perspectives feels about it. So moving along with a focus on residential infill, I just talked about it a little bit, the comprehensive plan policy of slowing canopy loss in those areas. In addition to the heritage tree requirement, which would apply across the entire city. On infill, there's another perimeter tree requirement, planting one tree for every 40 feet of lot frontage. Existing trees could count to meet that requirement. So existing trees in the public right-of-way or in front yards could count. That's something we hope would also support a reduction in canopy loss and potential growth and incline in canopy in these areas. And we'll give some specific examples. 2014 here, you see these vacant lots here that one time years ago were single family infill lots. Here's the street view from 2014 of those lots. It's tough to see, but there's some very large trees that likely would be heritage trees. And when that came through for development, again, the city doesn't currently regulate infill development. So when those individual lots are built, there's no regulations that would require any preservation out there, unless there's existing trees in the street right of way. But in 2020, here's what the aerial looks like. Here's what the street view. You can see all the large mature trees are gone. The proposed heritage tree regulations would require the preservation of heritage trees. There certainly would be some situations. There's some criteria that would allow for the removal of heritage trees if they overly restrict the buildable area of a lot. You also have the ability to disturb up to 50% of heritage tree critical root zones. So there is some flexibility built in there, but again, we really want some feedback on what the first iteration of the heritage tree requirement looks like. Some additional real world examples. This is 3rd Ward, circa 2012, very urban dense neighborhood in Uptown. This is what it used to look like. Oh, sorry, up here on the top left, there's one home with some vacant lots and large trees. You can see in the street view on the right, on the bottom left, and the bottom right is the current 2020-21 reality. And there's no trees there, right? So in the future, there'd be a perimeter tree planting requirement on the frontage of that lot that would require perimeter trees. So in the future, that type of development would have to find a way to comply with tree canopy regulations and other disciplines regulations, and provide 1 tree for every 40 feet of lot frontage. And the last big 3 area, what we currently call Tree Save, is being rebranded as green area, and there's significant comprehensive plan policy to support this. I'll quickly go down those orange bullets there. Green area is a great tool to achieve policy objectives to increase the acreage of protected land in the city, to improve the quality of tree canopy. Tree canopy coverage alone isn't the best tool to increase the benefits for a community. It makes sense to look at the quality, diversification, and the actual neighborhood scale benefits that tree canopy provides. We're proposing to require preservation in all development sites that are regulated, except for infill. So you will see that in just a second, that green area requirements will apply to more properties now than previously. Updated development regulations to have more flexibility to mitigate impacts from infill. We talked about that. A decline in infill single lot areas is the highest decline in canopy we have across the city. And then lastly was preservation of large, healthy, mature trees. That supports heritage trees, but also supports Tree Save and some other non-regulatory programs. I'm moving towards the end here, but really want to finish strong with the green area. So on the left here, a single family subdivision area currently per the tree ordinance is required 10% of tree save. You have to save 10% of existing tree canopy on the site. We're proposing to increase that to 15% to better support comprehensive plan policies and then the recommendations of the stakeholder group for the tree canopy action plan. There are some new options. Most of these options would only be available for the commercial type development. The items in orange would be a new option or an existing option that's really been overhauled and is very new in a sense. Green roof option exists, but we're expanding that to allow for multiple types of green roof elements that would allow for many different vegetation types, not just trees. And there's different values in those columns to the right, tier 1, tier 2, 3, 4. Different values are currently proposed for each type of element based on how well they compare to a general tree safe area. Also green walls, that's a new one. And green walls and green roof could be features that are provided on a roof, on a terraced approach. Green walls, of course, could also occur on sidewalk grade development areas. The off-site mitigation requirement, or excuse me, option on the top right. That's the current option, but we've expanded that option for development customers to allow more viability and more flexibility. So right now, to meet off-site tree save, if you qualify, you have to donate land to a conservation entity and then protect it with a second conservation entity via conservation easement. That requirement was simplified. It still exists, but we've also created a second method where development customers could simply plat tree save on another property, record it with the Register of Deeds with some deed restrictions, and that's it. So a much easier method to achieve off-site mitigation. And last but not least, donation of land to the city's tree canopy preservation program. That can be donated directly to the city within TCPP. So again, trying to expand the options and flexibility for development customers, also trying to achieve more canopy preservation. I'm almost there. So there's some additional extra credit provisions proposed. Preservation of specimen trees, these are significant, larger, or very special hardwood trees or understory trees. Proposing you get double credit for that. So the existing drip line of those trees, if preserved within a tree save area, you get twice the acreage of the canopy of those trees or those patches of trees. Also, if you preserve your tree save adjacent with existing preservation areas, you get 1 1/4 extra credit. Along waterways, riparian areas, possibly ponds, water quality, wetland type areas, you'd get 1 1/4 extra credit. And steep slopes, you get 1 1/4. So we're hopeful that those are popular options with development customers that really help provide some additional economic, environmental, and social benefits via the additional tree save. Okay, that was a lot of talking and a lot of regulations. Ready to get to some questions. Let me toss it back to Andrew.
Cool. Thank you for doing all that talking. I'll give you a break, at least for the time being, and take on the first question that we have here. It's from Stacy. It says, will the tree requirements have any specifications for the size of the trees being preserved? So to go back to what Tim said earlier about heritage trees, there is that requirement in the UDO, proposed UDO draft. All trees that are 30 inches diameter at breast height or greater that are native to Charlotte or native to North Carolina and are healthy. That's another key component of this. They have to be healthy tree. They can't be diseased or dead. They must be preserved. They can be removed with a permit. So mitigation being that planting and the fee. So that's really the only, and Tim can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the only size requirement in terms of trees that are preserved. Tree save, what Tim was talking about earlier, is an option that people can use to comply with the green area requirements. There is no tree size component of the trees that need to be preserved in tree save. That's really just looking at sort of the trees themselves and their critical root zones. I think it's like, I don't know exactly what the distance from the base of the trees, but that's more of an area of your site that you have to save. It's sort of irrespective of the size of the trees that are being saved. So there is also a requirement to plant trees. So where there is a requirement to plant trees, generally that's either a 2-inch diameter tree or a 3-inch diameter tree, are the tree planting requirements. And I don't know if we have that in here, but and the residential infill requirement would allow a sort of a customer to save a tree on site to meet that requirement. So there's a size component there as well, where if you're developing a single family home, you're required to comply with this tree planting requirement. Instead of planting a tree of 2-inch caliper, you can save a tree on your site that's 2 inches or greater to meet that requirement. And I'll let Tim jump in if I misspoke on anything.
Oh, I think you covered it really well, Andrew. The heritage tree proposed regulation is really the biggest size requirement driven regulation that we have. There is a size component to many other regulations, and you covered it well. Planting requirements, there's minimum size for certain planting requirements. It varies slightly between street trees or internal trees, things like that. There's also that minimum size requirement if you're going to use an existing tree to meet a proposed regulation. So no, I think you covered it really well, and that was a good answer.
Thanks. The next question is from Faith. The question is, with mitigation fee for heritage trees, would one have to get permission to remove the tree if it's dead or diseased? And would this apply to every landowner? How would the city monitor or staff this? To save Tim's voice I'll start and then you jump in. So if it is diseased, dead, dying, we view that as tree removal that is helping, right? So that tree is not a help to the community. It's arguably a hazard. Those trees can be removed without a permit. I think there may be, so there's some questions in terms of enforcement of, will there need to be any proof of that? I think that's under discussion. I think there might need to be some sort of, get a forester to come check it out and determine it to be dead, take a picture of it, have some sort of evidence that it is in fact dead. Shouldn't be too difficult, just in case there is city staff that needs to come back and verify that. But the tree could be removed without a permit. And in terms of the monitoring of it, that is definitely a really good question of how would we regulate every tree that's over 30 inches in Charlotte. Charlotte has a lot of big trees, and certainly something that we're thinking through and trying to plan through in terms of a staff perspective. But I don't know if Tim, if you want to add any more detail to your plans for monitoring it.
Sure. And real quick, just to add to the hazardous tree scenario, that's something that we'd have to really get a better sense on is how to enforce that level. But we would craft policy that would not, we don't want to reduce any response time. If there's an immediate hazard and emergency situation, then a tree could be removed, and we don't want to reduce or increase any risk to property or life, certainly. But pivoting to the enforcement component, we acknowledge this is a very big step. This would be a protection level that's extended to these trees at all times. It's not just development triggered. So right now, there is a very different type of heritage tree provision in the current tree ordinance that applies to single family subdivisions. And it really only applies if a site's coming through permitting. So it has to be triggered. That protection level has to be triggered. This heritage tree requirement, as it's currently proposed, would be a blanket protection. At some point, if this was adopted by council, whenever the implementation date occurred, at that point, moving forward, any tree that qualifies would be protected. And within a land development permitting scenario, a developer, a property owner would have to obtain a permit to remove it unless it's an emergency. But if it's outside of that type of permitting scenario, a property owner, let's say they want to remove a heritage tree to build a vegetable garden, that would also require a permit. There'd be a non-land development general permit enforcement approach, and the city would have to put some resources into a team of inspectors to process those permit reviews and inspections reasonably quickly to support just quality customer service. So again, that's kind of the general regulatory approach as it's currently written, and it's a significant step. You do have the ability to impact the root zone of these trees up to 50%. So if a site has a heritage tree on it and that tree has grown for decades with a foundation of a home 4 feet away, if someone wants to demo that home and rebuild a new home, there'd be an allowance to disturb the root zone up to the previous foundation line, as one example. There's a starting point of no disturbance within a 10-foot offset of the tree trunk. But again, if there's a prior condition in place, that offset would be waived in some scenarios. If heritage tree critical root zones impact more than 50% of a site's buildable area, then those trees could potentially be removed. That's an attempt to allow some flexibility and balance. We want some feedback on this. We really do, to make sure if we move forward with this, it's the right fit for Charlotte. So yeah, I'll stop there, and hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks. I also want to point out that there are, if you are in a historic district, there may be additional requirements. And so we're talking specifically only about the tree protection article 29. If you live or you're developing in a historic district, just want to encourage folks to also check out those standards as well. But I'm not entirely versed in historic district regulations, just that sometimes trees can be a factor that needs to be submitted for review by staff. So just to point that out. We have another question from Faith. How will the city play catch up to developments that won't be grandfathered into the new mitigation requirements? An example is Arrowwood Road near 485 and across from Topgolf. Can't believe the impact of loss. How will the city play catch up to developments?
Well, if I could jump in, Andrew, real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
I do want to clarify and emphasize that another big step we're proposing, I don't think I hit this really hard earlier, but I do want to put it out there, is that any current exemptions for tree save, green area, as we're calling it now, some sites in transit areas, in very urban dense centers, they're exempt from providing any tree save. Also, existing sites that were previously developed sites that have existing buildings. Right now, if they come through for redevelopment and the development customer is retaining one or more buildings, there's no tree save requirement. We're proposing to eliminate all exemptions. Now, those sites may qualify for more options, but the proposal is that they would have to, in the future, comply with the green area requirement. So that doesn't really get to the heart, if I understand the question right, of catch up, because once canopy's gone, it's gone. So I think, probably outside the UDO, there's some really strong policy objectives in the comprehensive plan that are non-regulatory, community-driven programs, are guiding us towards increasing tree planting where we can, targeting preservation through possibly capital projects in the future in a different way, making sure that tree canopy is a component that's valued and part of the whole spectrum of city programming. So I think the best way to catch up would be to utilize our non-regulatory programs. It might be operations-based, it might be kind of strategic community programs. Tree Charlotte comes to example, that partnership, the tree canopy preservation program, our capital projects work. I think that's the best way. In addition to having new regulations that require planting and preservation, that's the best way, that multi-pronged approach to get some canopy in there. Hopefully that kind of connected with the basis of the question.
Thanks, Tim. So we also have some more city staff on the call. I'm going to allow Jay Wilson, who's with our soil erosion and sedimentation team. He volunteered to talk about the Topgolf site, so feel free to jump in, Jay. You should be able to unmute.
Sure. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yep, sounds great.
I just wanted to mention that Topgolf site certainly looks a little different than a lot of projects you may have seen in Charlotte in the past, but really what you're seeing there is a site that was subject to all current permitting regulations and tree save requirements. And it's such a large site, they're able to, section off their tree save and open space areas, into concentrated areas mainly along the waterways that are in the back and the bottom of that site. But that site did meet all the current tree save requirements. So that isn't necessarily something that would have changed a whole lot, except for the new green space requirements, under the UDO. But just the sheer size of that site makes it look different in scale to what we're used to seeing around here. So that site didn't slip by unpermitted or anything like that.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, it's a good point to bring up about tree save. That sometimes it can be located in areas where you don't see it. So let me see. I have a question here from Jim. The question is, do we have an estimate of how much cost increases the proposed tree protection will add to the total land plus improvement cost for each sort of built upon area in a started home. So any kind of so I'll say that we don't have necessarily hard numbers to share of sort of what the added cost would be. I know that the UDO as a whole is undergoing an economic impact analysis. I'm not sure if that will be included in the ultimate results. We had a question about this earlier in the first session. We're going to find out more about that economic analysis in the coming weeks, but if anybody wants to add anything about that, feel free to, but I don't have a hard number to share during this call.
And adding something real quick to that as well. We certainly acknowledge that increased preservation and planting requirements will have a cost impact. I think the heritage tree is a good example. There could be increases in kind of due diligence and survey work to identify those trees. There certainly would be an impact for planting costs for infill development if a site has to preserve, but also maybe plant one or more perimeter trees. Right now there's no requirement to do that, so that could definitely, we acknowledge there's going to be some cost impacts. Just wanted to share that.
Yep. Next question is from Dr. Sylvia Biddle-Patton. What's the current policy regarding large heritage trees causing buckling in sidewalks in close in and established communities, and how will that change once the UDO is adopted? Essentially, the add-on comment that I see there is which one will be sacrificed, the large trees or the sidewalks? So I don't know, Tim, you want to talk about how we deal with street trees and sidewalks?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So we didn't cover it here, but in the UDO, it may be in a different article. Internally, there was some significant conversations on having a more direct and clear decision-making matrix when there are competing interests. Tree preservation is very important, of course, to people who value trees and the urban forestry staff, the city arborist office. But when you bring in new streetscape requirements or traffic studies that require additional lanes and things like that, utilities, my colleagues in Charlotte Water, that's a huge thing. There's a lot of pressure on infrastructure there. There is some proposed, I'll call it decision-making guidance for how to balance that in certain scenarios on what interest may kind of take precedence in certain things. In general, we want to preserve heritage trees. City trees would not be qualified as heritage trees. Like, there's already a very strong protection and preservation requirement there. So if there is an ADA concern or a safety concern where a healthy, structurally sound city tree or private tree that's a heritage tree that's impacting a public or a private access point like a sidewalk, multi-use trail, et cetera, there'd have to be strong justification to preserve it. There'd have to be some type of mitigation, possibly meandering a sidewalk or some other type of action that could mitigate that concern. And if there's not, it may be a situation where a healthy, structurally sound tree has to be removed. And again, we want to apply that decision-making matrix and guidance. Certainly, we're talking about development requirements here with the UDO, but also across the spectrum of the city's programs to have a most consistent approach for capital projects, for general maintenance work from CDOT, from CATS, from the city's landscape management group, as much as possible. So that's the best answer I can provide right now, is that there's some better decision-making guidance for staff and customers and the public. I think those are in the subdivision streets and infrastructure article, but there's a lot of tree components to them in certain areas. Hopefully that answered the question.
Next question is from Joe Mega. Is there any particular concern with forest loss around the mountain island lake area?
There's nothing specific called out in the proposed tree protection article that focuses on any geographic area in the city. We didn't touch on it very much, but I'll click over to a slide here. Our green area requirements are based on place types, and there's some great work going on with the policy map related to the comprehensive plan right now. So, the short answer is no, there isn't.
Thanks.
These are tiers, like these different place types in each tier would, connect to a level of flexibility options for development types. Single family subdivision would not qualify for options. They would have to preserve existing trees. But, commercial types, currently the options are broken out by your location and a center corridor or wedge location. That's translating to a place type framework.
Thanks, Tim. Let me see. I don't see.
Good questions. I really appreciate the interest and the feedback.
Absolutely. We do have one more here from Dr. Sylvia Biddle-Patton. Can you explain again how you arrived at the $1,000 mitigation fee? It's a really good question. Tim, do you want to take that one on?
Sure. We did a peer city review, and that was a really important component that led us to look at finding, our first proposed fee level for that. The current tree ordinance has a couple different options in how to assess fines, and I know that's a different thing, but within the industry allowed fine regulations we have, there's an appraisal method that's an industry component where there's a certain way you can appraise the value of a tree. And that used to be employed very significantly and routinely by the city. And what we found is that it is greatly skewed towards placing value on the size of a tree. So significant trees, 20 inches and greater, certainly heritage trees, the appraised value would often really quickly get to $20,000 or more based on the size. So that was something we reviewed internally a few years ago with the attorney's office and felt it made more sense to apply a different approach. Other industry acceptable methods include a flat fee, like the $1,000, or a multiplier. For example, the current city tree mitigation requirement. If you're authorized to remove a city tree, the starting point is $200 per inch. So we felt heritage trees are a very important preservation step. And the proposed current approach would be a strong preservation regulatory approach. However, we wanted to make sure we had some consideration for the balance for development professionals, development community, but also property owners. So we knew we didn't want to go with the appraisal method. That skewed way too high. The multiplier method seems to be a good fit for city trees because those are city assets that are maintained by the city. There's a lot of resources put into maintaining those. Private property trees felt like we needed to scale that below those other two levels. And when we looked at other cities, their mitigation payment requirements are much higher. Atlanta has a higher recompense value. They have a multiplier that I think starts with trees 6 or 8 inches or greater, and a removal of any of those trees would have a multiplier per inch. We felt that was a little bit too much for Charlotte, based on feedback from the tree canopy action plan stakeholders. We arrived at $1,000 flat fee as a good starting point because we felt it carries enough weight to show that these trees are valuable. And we proposed, as far as a deterrent to remove those trees, is if they're removed in violation, it'd be $200 an inch. So a 30-inch tree, to remove it with authorization, would be $1,000 starting point. That could be reduced to $500. The starting point would be $1,000. If that tree was removed in violation and the city pursued a violation and assessed a fine, right now we've proposed $200 an inch. So that'd be $6,000 We're trying to find the right balance between not impacting property rights and development rights, but also ensuring we preserve the trees and show they have value and have a deterrent that will motivate folks to go through the permit process, because the deterrent, fines and penalties are there to deter actions that violate ordinances. So, the $200 an inch felt like an appropriate starting point. But I will say this is the area that we really have the most interest in getting feedback on, because it's really new. We know it's big. We think it connects to tree canopy policy and the comprehensive plan. But we know it's a big step and it will impact property owners. So please let us know. I appreciate the questions on this.
The next question we got is from Faith, talking about the tree canopy loss in Charlotte. So if 4% of the tree canopy has been lost in 6 years, what's your projections on slowing down the tree loss? I'll say a couple of things. First, I think that's why the tree canopy action plan was really important. We looked at sort of a map of tree loss, and then we overlaid it with kind of likely place types in Charlotte, and kind of got a picture of what our current tree canopy is and what the place types could be. And obviously the place types are still obviously being resolved with the policy map. So it was a projection, not necessarily definitive. We kind of got an existing canopy percentage for each place type and set the tiers up in our, so tier 1 through tier 4 for the green area requirements based on existing canopy. So we know that our tier 4 place types, neighborhood 1, makes up, I think the average tree canopy cover in neighborhood 1 areas was like nearly 65%. And so we wanted to obviously prioritize the most tree save in those areas, tree save on site, actually saving trees as your only option for green area. But those tier 1 sites, we kind of saw that they really have very few trees today. And so having a high sort of criteria for saving trees on site wasn't going to make much of a difference in terms of the overall city's canopy percentage. So we tried to balance the regulations in a way that made sense to preserve the kind of the remaining assets that we have and try and grow the canopy in our neighborhood place types. On top of that, I think we're exploring possibly how to model and sort of understand what the future of tree canopy is. And so we're looking at statistical ways to project that out, but I don't think that we have that ready unless, Tim, you had anything else to add about that.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that. I did want to just let folks on the meeting know that after the UDO is adopted, our next step is to take on an update of the urban forest master plan, and within that effort, and hopefully maybe before that effort, we can take on some additional analysis because we want to look at our tree canopy goal, which is 50 by 50, right? 50% coverage citywide. It's time to really dig in and look at that and get guidance from the community to see if it makes sense to keep that or expand it or start over or a combination of all those things. And our goal is to have a additional analysis to have us get to a point where we're better informed to connect all policy areas, including the UDO. So I could envision down the road learning more during that initiative and possibly looking at consideration of tweaking some regulatory approaches within the tree protection article to better fit with any new tree canopy goal policy. That seems like a big lift and a long way away, but it's something we need to plan for, because if we learn more about our canopy in the next 2 years and our regulations don't really align with that, well, I think it's a good case to consider looking at connecting them better. But not just our regulations, our operational work and our non-regulatory programs. So thanks for bringing it up, Andrew. I appreciate that.
Yeah. I don't see any other questions. I don't know if anybody has a question that they haven't asked and or maybe you missed, feel free to raise your hand and we can let you jump in. But We are actually just about at time, so this is kind of perfect timing, but we appreciate everybody taking the time out of their evening schedule, eating their dinner quick and getting to this public meeting. And, we really appreciate all the thoughtful questions. So feel free to reach out and let us know if you have additional questions. We're going to be having continued conversations on other standards in the UDO, and these sessions are also recorded. So if there's anything that we talked about tonight, you want to go back and watch, they will be on our UDO website at charlotteudo.org. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for coming out, and appreciate you being here.